Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Arfat and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'm actually starting somewhat of a series, the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament. Right? And this will be from materials in this book, which is Israel's Scriptures in Early Christian Writings. Israel's Scriptures in Early Christian Writings. This is published by Ehrmans. And this is a compilation of essays. And I'm going to dedicate one video per chapter in this 1,000 page book. And inshallah, we are going to go through this entire book in this series. Now, the series will not have a subsequent video, like one video after the other, right? Because I have some of the videos planned as well. And so, whenever I finish reading a chapter or so, I will actually make a video. And recently I finished reading one chapter and a half, right? So I'll make the video for the first chapter. Actually, I finished two chapters, but we're going to skip the first chapter because the chapter is an introduction. We don't really need to discuss that. Okay, so without further ado, we will begin. Now, perhaps maybe I'll use the first few points of the introduction because it is actually important. The scholars here, or at least the editors, have concluded that we actually do not have the scriptures that the Christians of the first century, quote unquote Christians, or the followers of Jesus, have at the first century. In the first century, we basically have certain books that are found in the Masoretic text, and that is the Hebrew Bible. And we also knew or are aware of certain texts that have been quoted by the early Christians or rabbis based on the manuscripts tradition. But when it comes to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, as well as the complete comparison of it, that means the comparison is like for like, every single page, every single word. We don't have those sort of things, just so we are clear. And we also know that the third part of the Tanakh is somewhat disputed. There are research which seems to suggest, if you read this book, whereby the Masoretic text, when it comes to the book of Daniel, Songs of Solomon, Lamentations, so on and so forth, the canonicity of these books are actually disputed by scholars, meaning to say that what we have today as the Hebrew canon of scriptures, right, the third part of the Tanakh is basically in dispute as to whether the Christians of the first century actually regard these texts as scriptures, right? And so one thing that we should understand here is that just because we have the books in the Bible, that doesn't mean that we have the same books within the Bible today compared to in the past. And textual criticism seems to demonstrate successfully that we do not actually have like for like the same books, the same text, the same manuscripts. And just because the Book of Lamentation, the Songs of Solomon, so on and so forth, is actually found in certain canon of scriptures, that doesn't mean they are found today, but that doesn't mean that the people of the past regard these books as sacred scriptures. This is true for the Hebrew Bible, this is true for the New Testament as well. Right. And so basically what this seems to show or demonstrate is that the Masoretic text, the canon of the Hebrew Bible, on the which is actually fully canonized or accepted by the 10th century, or at least the 1000s, is basically something that is novel at the time. And the early Christians, quote unquote Christians, or the Jews of the first century CE, do not necessarily regard every single book that I found in the Hebrew Bible today, Hebrew Scripture, as sacred texts or sacred writings. And this is true for the New Testament as well, because when the New Testament quotes from Isaiah, right, quotes from Deuteronomy a lot, right, and some other passages as well. But the New Testament almost doesn't quote, for certain, almost doesn't quote from the minor prophets, right? We have the major prophet, the minor prophets. Almost doesn't quote from the writings, right? The third part of the Torah is called the writings. We have the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The Ketuvim part has almost never been quoted by the New Testament authors. And so this seems, as what scholars thought about this, is that it could be that these texts were not deemed as sacred scriptures during the time of Jesus, right? And so, which is why they don't quote. But some scholars argue that in the Acts of Apostle, Paul actually quotes pagan authors, philosophers, right? And so that doesn't mean that whenever someone quote from a certain text, and these certain quotations are found in what later deemed to be a sacred scripture, that doesn't mean that the authors of the one writing the text or quoting the text regard these quotations as sacred scriptures and authoritative, right? And so no Christians today would accept that whatever Paul quotes from the pagan authors are actually something that is sacred, right? These texts are found in sacred scriptures, right? These writings or these quotations are found in sacred scriptures, which is the Bible, the New Testament, the Pauline epistle, but that doesn't mean that Paul regard these texts or these quotations that he quoted, which are found in his writings, as sacred scripture or sacred wordings or something that is authoritative. Because if you understood Paul, you'll know that Paul is almost polemical in nature, right? Especially in his epistles to the Corinthians and to the Galatians, right? And so there is one sort of something that is striking, whereby during the time of Jesus, mostly the Ketuvim, part of the what we call today the third part of the Tanakh, is basically something that the sacrosity, or how do you pronounce that word, right? Whether this part of the text or the book of the Tanakh is mostly not considered as sacred scriptures, whereas Jews today regard this as sacred scriptures, right? And so there is a huge distinction here if you are aware of the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. And so there are 5 different ways of how people quote the Old Testament. The New Testament authors quote the Old Testament, and how the Old Testament actually quote the Old Testament as well. Right? We found this as well, that we have the book of Chronicles as well, quoting from the major prophets, as well as quoting from Deuteronomy, quoting from the Torah. Right? And so this demonstrates that the Torah was actually written first, right? And then all the writings of the other prophetic writings, they were all much later. They were compiled and they were canonized much later. And so during this time, for example, the book of Daniel, so on and so forth, these people already regard the Torah as something that is sacred, right? Now, there are 5 different ways here of how actually quotations were actually done. Okay. Or the first one is like direct citations. Okay. Here, page 10, the author here wrote, by marked citations, we understand an explicit citation of a discrete text that is marked for the reader in some way. This marking is most usually accomplished by an introductory formula of some kind. For example, as it is written, or Isaiah says. Right? This is found in the Gospel. But this can also be marked for the readers in other ways, including by the presence of an interpretive gloss. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15:7, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. Right? And 1 Corinthians here, Paul here is quoting Psalm chapter 8 verse 6. Okay, Psalm 8 verse 6. Okay, but when it says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that this does not include the one who put all things in subjection under him. Basically, God doesn't put all things, right? He is not putting himself under his foot to be subjected by him, right? That's what it means. And so Mark citation is very clear, right? Not Mark the gospel, like Mark, right? A Mark form of citation, meaning a certain citation. And this is, and how do we know this? Because the gospel author says, right, as it is written in Isaiah, the prophets, right, or as Isaiah says, so on and so forth. Another one is unmarked citations, meaning the citations is there, right, but did not begin with Isaiah says this, as it is written in the prophets, so on and so forth, right. And so an unmarked citation might have a verbatim agreement with a scriptural predecessor text, but is not marked as such for the reader in any way. And so a Gentile with little exposure to scripture might have no indication that a foreign text is being cited. For example, 1 Corinthians 5:13, God will judge those outside. Drive out the wicked person from among you. Right? And this is actually in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 17:7, 19:19, 21:21, 22:21, Deuteronomy 24, 21, 22, 21, and 24, and 24:7. But by leaving it unmarked, Paul allows the reader to simply hear this as a direct imperative. Right? Another one is verbal allusion, and this is found a lot. A verbal allusion is a reference to a specific word or strings of words without an explicit marker, meaning it is not cited, right, and is not quoted verbatim. Right? Meaning it contains certain words that have been, or certain texts or phrases that have been paraphrased. Right? For example, John 1:1. Right? In the beginning was the Word. Right? And this is an allusion to Genesis, right? Chapter 1. And another one is conceptual allusion. Right? Verbal allusion in play of the words. Right? But conceptual allusion is giving the idea, but not necessarily have the same allusion or the same exact quotations, but it is a completely different word, but it gives the idea, right? And this is also found a lot in the New Testament, right? And then obviously the fifth one is not found in this book, and that is something that is considered whereby, is this really a quotation, or is this really not a quotation, right? We have these ideas, so on and so forth, right? And so this is the fifth category that is much lower down in its grades, right? It could be whereby the whole chapter in itself is actually portraying an idea of the past, and we found this in certain chapters of the New Testament, for example, whereby, for example, we have the Lord's Prayer, for example, right? And it is actually a direct idea. This idea is an allusion back. This entire chapter is an allusion, or pericope is an allusion back to how the prophets of the Old Testament actually worship and actually pray, so on and so forth, even though it is not explicitly written. Right? So this is the weakest form of interpretation or hermeneutics, and so, or the weakest form of what we call today as the use of the Old Testament in the New. Right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave it as it is today here. Right? In the next video of this series, we will look at certain passages in detail, and perhaps I'll have my whiteboard up, and then we can actually compare the passages and what it really means. Right? When the New Testament authors quote these passages of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, what do they really mean? Right? And most of the time you'll be surprised is that most of them actually do not mean what the Old Testament actually meant. Right? And so we have a form of anachronism as well within the New Testament, and the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Right? Within the Hebrew Bible as well, we have a form of anachronism. And you'll be striking to know, in fact, some of you might already know, that we have the story of Abraham and his sons being quoted by Paul. And what Paul meant here is completely different than what the authors of Genesis actually meant, as well as the concept of sin, right? And law of Moses, right? Because Paul says that it is through the law, right, that you know sin, but somehow it is through the law you always sin, right? And so, is this really an understanding of what the law actually is when it comes to the Torah, right? And so, once we get to that part, it's actually interesting to actually know that even Paul himself fell into anachronism. But we'll take a look at that text, and we'll take a look at some of our literatures here from Hermania as well as Anchor Bible commentaries to supplement our series. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.